The small town of Barfleur lies roughly 30 kilometers east of Cherbourg. Its port had been fortified by the Germans, and the Allies now planned to use it for bringing in supplies.
Together with his colleagues, Jack Leap viewed the defences that had been installed on the beaches and the bunkers the Germans had built. To assess the situation in and around Barfleur, one of Hitler's field marshals had paid a personal visit to the area as late as May 1944, but as it turned out, Barfleur was never one of the targets of the first wave of the invasion. Rommel was impressed by the enemy operation in Normandy.
Technically and strategically, the landings in Normandy were an outstanding achievement.
When the Germans withdrew from Saint-Lô, the town was in ruins. George Stevens and his team filmed in Saint-Lô in early August. It was here that the Allies made the decisive breakthrough in the battle for Normandy. A bridge hurriedly repaired by US sappers secured the supply line to the west. Saint-Lô served the Germans as an important traffic junction for the redeployment of troops, so the town had been bombed and shelled time and again. In a letter home, a German lance corporal wrote,
"Today I spoke to someone who had fought on the Eastern Front. He said things had also been tough in the East, but never as tough as they are here. If a German soldier deserts to the enemy, his family doesn't get any support. And if we were to win the war, he would have to be handed over to be dealt with."
Week after week passed, with the Allies making only slow progress. But in the end, the Americans achieved the decisive breakthrough. On July the 26th, 1944, they took the small town of Marigny. Shelling and strafing had reduced many buildings to rubble. George Stevens and his team filmed the destruction. The fighting morale of the German troops declined rapidly. On July the 26th, a paramedic noted this remark by a soldier who had been wounded.
"I'll tell you one thing, medic. Here in Normandy, it's not war anymore. The enemy is superior in both men and material. Without adequate weapons, we are simply being sent to our deaths. Our military leaders are doing nothing whatsoever to help us. For me, the war's over."
For most Americans, the only good German was a dead one. The Waffen-SS were particularly hated because of the repeated reports of wounded GIs being murdered. The black uniforms, it seems, were coveted trophies.
In the major offensive in July, 40,000 American servicemen had been killed or wounded. The troops who had survived were exhausted from weeks of fighting.
George Stevens had received instructions from the highest level that, first of all, he was to follow General Patton's troops as they advanced towards Brittany. The men in his unit respected the Hollywood director. Yet Stevens, who always seemed to be grumpy, remained something of an enigma to them. One of his colleagues remarked later that
he was uncommunicative and looked serious even when he was making a joke.
On August the 15th, 1944, an armada of nearly 900 ships approached the coast of southern France. On board one vessel were American film director William Wyler and his camera teams, The operation was only about half the size of the invasion of Normandy. 3 American divisions went ashore on the first day alone.
The BBC informed the French resistance about the imminent launching of this second invasion by broadcasting coded messages. Garby is sleeping in the grass, Nancy has got a stiff neck, and the hunter is hungry.
German prisoners of war had to help unload the ships. In contrast to D-Day, in the coastal town of Saint-Tropez, the GIs met with hardly any resistance. There was one brief firefight which cost less than 100 American lives. Afterwards, supplies could be brought ashore unimpeded. The Nazi leadership displayed a lethargic reaction to the news from the south of France. In his diary, Joseph Goebbels remarked laconically that
the enemy claims that the contingent that has now landed is more powerful than the one that came ashore in Normandy. But they're only saying that to scare us. It will, of course, take us a few days to implement our countermeasures, because obviously we can't position adequate numbers of troops at every place on the coast to repel an enemy landing operation.
Even after the Normandy landings, the dangers for the civilian population still existed. The Germans had mined many towns and villages to impede the advancing Allied troops. George Stevens and his camera team were filming in the town of Coutances when a German landmine suddenly exploded. The GIs took cover just in case there might be other blasts. US paramedics were on the spot immediately because one soldier had obviously been wounded.
In Coutances, US sappers had made most of the roads passable again. The Americans had assembled 15,000 men in the area to open up supply routes blocked by wrecked German vehicles. Even though countless houses had been destroyed in the fighting, most French people were relieved to be liberated by the Allies. By now, they were no longer afraid that the invasion might fail and the Germans would return. But many wondered about the immediate future. Would the Americans ensure a supply of food to the population? And who would be in control in Normandy in the future? The occupying forces or the French themselves, under the leadership of Charles de Gaulle?
George Stevens had been given permission to film a German prisoner of war camp. This was the Hollywood director's first encounter with the defeated enemy, a foe who had put up such fierce resistance over the last few weeks. The few possessions the soldiers had with them were carefully inspected. By now, most of the German prisoners were glad that for them the war was over. The fighting had demoralized them. According to a US report,
many Germans created a lethargic impression. Large numbers of those taken prisoner were exhausted. The Americans found that young soldiers in particular had believed Nazi propaganda. In fact, one prisoner said to a GI, "There's not much of New York left standing, is there?" "What are you talking about?" the GI asked. "Well," the German replied, "it was bombed by the Luftwaffe, wasn't it?"
Captured German soldiers were transported away from the front and later put on ships. Thousands were sent to prisoner of war camps in Britain or the United States. where they remained until the war was over.
At Mont Saint-Michel, Jacques Lieb filmed American star photographer Robert Capa, who had documented the horrors of the landing on Omaha Beach on the morning of June the 6th. The American war reporters had gone on an outing to the medieval island fortress. Also present was author Ernest Hemingway, who was famous for his ability to hold his drink. Hemingway had come close to being killed by a German shell. Here it seems he has liberated a bar. Later, Robert Capa said Hemingway had accused him of not having helped him when the author sought cover from the shell in a ditch. That, Hemingway claimed, was because Capa wanted to take the first picture of the celebrated writer's corpse.
Meanwhile, to the north, the Allies had achieved a decisive breakthrough. But even so, many German units had managed to escape east. Paris was now within range, but a bizarre argument took place about the next steps to be taken. The talk was of an imminent uprising in the French capital, which might then be suppressed by the Germans with extreme measures.
General Charles de Gaulle told the commander-in-chief of the Allied forces, who actually wanted to bypass the French capital, "We must march into Paris." So on August the 22nd, 1944, Dwight D. Eisenhower gave the order for the French 2nd Armored Division to take Paris. The French were to liberate their capital themselves. The final stage of the advance through the suburbs of Paris was a victory parade. George Stevens and his cameraman were allowed to be present when French forces entered the capital on August the 24th. Later, he told his son that it had been the greatest day of his life.
Here, Stevens and his team are waiting at Montparnasse railway station for a delegation from the Wehrmacht. The city's commandant had been ordered to defend Paris to the last man and then blow up the most important buildings. But after a meeting with Hitler, General Dietrich von Choltitz was certain that he was showing loyalty to a madman. So he had decided to surrender the city without a fight. The surrender document was signed inside the railway station, where it was actually too dark to film. In the meantime, General de Gaulle had also arrived. He had organized French resistance from Britain. Now the day of his triumph over the hated Nazi occupiers had come. In order to capture the historic moment on film, George Stevens wanted those involved in the ceremony to repeat it outside. When Choltitz hesitated, the tipsy director is said to have remarked,
"C'est la guerre générale, that's war."
De Gaulle's strategy had paid off. Sitting in every ministry were people of his choice. The provisional government of the French Republic had assumed power, and not the Americans. Then it was time to celebrate. Later, Stevens' assistant, British screenwriter Ivan Moffat, remembered,
"One knew at the time it was going to be the most exhilarating day. I mean, it couldn't help but be, particularly as we thought that the war was pretty much over and that the Germans were in headlong retreat. The atmosphere was intoxicating, exhilarating, with these thousands and thousands of people embracing us, embracing each other under an absolutely brilliant sky. Paris looking absolutely marvelous, not at all shabby. an atmosphere almost like a bullfight.
At the request of US General Omar Bradley on August the 26th, 1944, de Gaulle took part in a parade of the US 28th Infantry Division on the Champs-Élysées. Reporter Ernie Pyle had experienced the boundless joy of the French on the day of their liberation. Now he was disappointed.
As usual, those Americans most deserving of seeing Paris will be the last ones to see it, if they ever do. By that I mean the fighting soldiers. Only one infantry regiment and one reconnaissance outfit of Americans actually came into Paris. And they passed on through the city quickly and went on with their war. The first ones in the city to stay were such non-fighters as the psychological warfare and civil affairs people, public relations men and correspondents. I heard more than one rear echelon soldiers say he felt a little ashamed to be getting all the grateful cheers and kisses for the liberation of Paris, when the guys who broke the German army and opened the way for Paris to be free were still out there fighting without the benefit of kisses or applause. But that's the way things are in this world.
Like many of his colleagues, George Stevens also took time out to sleep in a real bed and to write to his family.
The days and nights all ran over themselves and became pretty much one thing: the struggle to get to Paris. The doing and the 2 weeks before were the most exciting, the most unbelievable time of my life. I do hope you and Georgie have seen the newsreels that carried our film.